By now, the evidence had already transformed the Jackson family's understanding of its past. The long-held belief in Native American ancestry connected to the ancestor known as July was being challenged by both historical records and genetic science. But the story wasn't over. In fact, researchers were about to uncover another layer of the mystery, and this discovery would take the family history far beyond the plantations of South Carolina. It would eventually lead across the Atlantic Ocean to France. One of the most powerful aspects of modern genetic genealogy is its ability to trace paternal lineages through highly specific DNA markers. These markers function like breadcrumbs scattered across centuries. Each generation inherits them from the one before, and when scientists compare those markers across thousands of individuals, they can often identify the geographic origins of a family line. After Thomas Jackson completed advanced Y-DNA testing, researchers focused on a particular genetic signature found within his results. The marker belonged to a highly specific paternal branch associated with European ancestry. More importantly, it showed a strong connection to families of French origin. That finding immediately attracted attention because the Richebourg family itself traced its roots to French Huguenots. The Huguenots were French Protestants who faced severe religious persecution during the 16th and 17th centuries. Many fled France in search of safety. Some eventually settled in North America, where their descendants established communities throughout the American South. Over time, Stein and several Huguenot families became successful landowners, among them the Richebourgs. Suddenly, the genetic evidence aligned perfectly with the historical record. The DNA didn't merely connect the Jackson family to the Richebourgs. It pointed toward the Richebourgs' European origins as well. In practical terms, this meant something remarkable. The same genetic line that passed through James Joel Richebourg appears to have continued through July, then through Israel, then through generations of descendants who would eventually become the Jackson family. A bloodline that began centuries earlier in France may have quietly continued all the way to one of the most famous entertainers in human history. For many people, this revelation came as a complete surprise. After all, the Jackson family story had never centered around French ancestry. The focus had always been elsewhere, yet the DNA evidence suggested that a significant portion of the family's direct paternal line could be traced back to European settlers rather than the origins previously believed. Still, genealogy is rarely as simple as replacing one story with another. Family trees are complex. Each generation doubles the number of ancestors behind it. By the time researchers travel back several centuries, a single person may have hundreds or even thousands of ancestral connections. The discovery regarding July's paternal line did not erase every possibility of Native American ancestry elsewhere in the family tree. Researchers were careful to emphasize this point. While the direct male line appeared linked to the Richebourg family, other branches remained separate. Many descendants believe Native American ancestry may still exist through maternal lines or other ancestral connections. In genealogy, one discovery rarely explains everything. Instead, it adds another piece to a much larger puzzle. And for the Jackson family, that puzzle was becoming increasingly detailed. Yet beyond the scientific findings, there was also a deeply emotional dimension to the story, because every DNA result represents real people, real lives, real experiences. Learning that an ancestor's origins differ from what generations believed can be complicated. Sometimes it creates excitement, sometimes confusion, and sometimes grief, especially when the truth is connected to systems of oppression and exploitation. The evidence suggested that July's father may have been the very man who legally owned him and his mother. That reality carries a weight that extends far beyond genealogy charts and laboratory reports. It reminds us that family history is often shaped by forces much larger than any individual: war, migration, poverty, discrimination, and in this case, slavery. For descendants, understanding that history can be painful, but it can also be empowering, because every new discovery restores part of a story that was nearly lost for generations. July existed only as a distant figure remembered through fragments of oral history. Now researchers were beginning to see him more clearly, not as property, not as a name in a legal document, but as a human being whose life mattered, whose descendants would eventually influence global culture in ways nobody could have imagined. And perhaps that is what makes this discovery so extraordinary. The DNA evidence did not uncover scandal, it uncovered humanity. It restored connections that history had tried to erase. And it demonstrated how modern science can help families reclaim stories that once seemed impossible to recover. Yet as researchers continued exploring the Jackson family tree, another remarkable figure began emerging from the historical record, a man whose life bridged the gap between slavery and freedom, a man whose determination helped shape generations of descendants, a man whose legacy may still be visible in the ambition and resilience that later defined the Jackson family itself. His name was Israel, though many knew him by another name, Nero. And his story would become one of the most inspiring chapters in the entire family history. While the DNA evidence helped solve a centuries-old mystery, it also directed attention toward another extraordinary figure in the Jackson family story, a man whose life represented survival, determination, and resilience against overwhelming odds. His name was Israel, but history remembers him more commonly by another name, Nero. If July's story represents the hidden origins of the family line, then Nero's story represents its rebirth. Born during one of the most difficult periods in American history, Nero entered a world where freedom was still denied to millions of African Americans. His opportunities were limited from the moment he was born. His future was largely controlled by forces beyond his own choosing. Yet somehow, despite every obstacle placed before him, Nero managed to build something remarkable, and in doing so, he helped create the foundation for generations that followed. Family accounts describe Nero as a strong-willed and determined individual. According to stories passed down through descendants, he possessed a fierce sense of independence, a quality that often placed him at odds with those who sought to control him. Some accounts suggest that his resistance and unwillingness to submit quietly may have contributed to his transfer to another plantation during his lifetime. Whether every detail can be historically verified or not, family memory paints a consistent picture. Nero was not a man easily broken, and that spirit would become a defining characteristic of future generations, like his father July. Nero was associated with healing traditions and community knowledge. In an era when professional medical care was often unavailable to African Americans, especially in rural communities, individuals with herbal knowledge and healing skills played an important role. They became trusted figures, problem solvers, caretakers, people others turned to during times of need. These skills were often passed from generation to generation, not through formal schools, but through observation, experience, and oral tradition. In many ways, they represented another form of survival, a way of preserving knowledge despite a society that frequently denied access to education and opportunity. Then came one of the most significant turning points in American history, the Civil War, and eventually, emancipation. For formerly enslaved people, freedom created possibilities that had never existed before. But freedom alone did not guarantee success. Millions still faced poverty, discrimination, violence, and economic hardship. The transition from slavery to independence was far more difficult than many people today realize. Yet Nero refused to remain defined by the circumstances of his birth. Instead, he pursued something that represented both independence and security: land ownership. For African Americans during the late 19th century, owning land was more than a financial achievement. It was a declaration of freedom, a statement that one's future would no longer be controlled by someone else. Records and family histories suggest that Nero eventually acquired multiple parcels of land in Mississippi. For a man born into slavery, this was an extraordinary accomplishment. Every acre represented persistence. Every purchase represented progress. Every success represented victory over a system designed to prevent exactly that outcome. Nero became known as a hardworking and resourceful individual, someone willing to do whatever was necessary to provide for his family and build a better future. Those qualities would become deeply embedded within the family culture. Generations later, many observers would notice similar traits in another Jackson family patriarch, Joe Jackson. Like Nero, Joe possessed an intense drive to improve the lives of his family. Like Nero, he refused to accept limitations imposed by circumstance, and like Nero, he believed success required discipline, sacrifice, and relentless effort. Of course, history remembers Joe Jackson as a complex figure. His methods remain controversial. His parenting style has been debated for decades, but few people question his determination. The same determination that transformed a working-class family from Gary, Indiana, into one of the most successful entertainment dynasties in history. When viewed through the lens of family history, those characteristics begin to feel less surprising, because resilience often travels through generations, not genetically, but culturally. Parents teach children, children teach grandchildren. Values survive long after individuals are gone, and in many ways, Nero's influence appears to have survived through the generations that followed him. Yet his story was not without hardship. As he grew older, illness reportedly made it increasingly difficult for him to manage his land and maintain his livelihood. Financial pressures mounted. Eventually, according to family accounts, debt became a serious problem. The result was devastating. Property that Nero had spent years working to acquire was ultimately lost. Land ownership had represented freedom. Losing it felt like watching part of that freedom disappear. Sadly, Stories like this were common throughout the post-Civil War South. Many African American landowners faced discriminatory lending practices, legal manipulation, and economic systems designed to keep wealth concentrated elsewhere. For countless families, building prosperity proved difficult. Keeping it proved even harder. Yet even though Nero lost much of what he had worked to build, his legacy survived. Not through property, not through wealth, but through family. His descendants carried forward the lessons he left behind: persistence, adaptability, determination, hope. And as the generations continued, those qualities would eventually help produce one of the most famous families on earth, the Jacksons. But before the world knew the name Jackson, the family still had one more generation to pass through, one more chapter before music history would change forever. Because the road from Nero's Mississippi farmland to global superstardom would eventually pass through a steel mill worker in Indiana, a man named Joe Jackson, and his story would transform everything. By the early 20th century, the Jackson family had already traveled an extraordinary journey. Generations earlier, and their ancestors had endured slavery, displacement, and the loss of identity. They survived systems designed to deny them freedom. They built families despite impossible circumstances, and through persistence and resilience, they carried their story forward. Now, another chapter was about to begin, one that would eventually place the Jackson name before millions of people around the world. The path from Nero's generation to modern fame was neither simple nor predictable. Like many African American families during the early 20th century, the Jacksons faced economic hardship and racial discrimination. Opportunities remained limited. The future often felt uncertain, and like countless others, they searched for something better. A chance, a beginning, a new life. Over time, members of the family joined a massive movement that would reshape American history, the Great Migration. Millions of African Americans left the South in search of work, education, and opportunity in northern industrial cities. Among those destinations, one city would become especially important to the Jackson family: Gary, Indiana. Located near Chicago, Gary was a booming industrial center built around steel production. The work was hard, the hours were long, but for many families, it offered possibilities that simply did not exist elsewhere. It was there that a young man named Joe Jackson began building his future. Long before he became known as the father of music legends, Joe was simply a hardworking laborer trying to provide for his growing family. Day after day, he worked at a steel mill. The job demanded strength, patience, endurance. But Joe carried ambitions beyond the factory floor. Music had always been part of his life. As a young man, he dreamed of becoming a performer himself. Like many aspiring musicians, he hoped talent and determination would eventually open doors. But life often has different plans. Responsibilities came first, family came first, and Joe gradually accepted that his own musical dreams might never fully materialize. Yet fate had something else in mind. According to family history, Joe owned a guitar that he rarely allowed his children to touch. It was one of the few reminders of his own musical aspirations. Then one day, his son Tito borrowed the instrument without permission. While playing it, he accidentally damaged one of the strings. Terrified of his father's reaction, he prepared for punishment. Instead, something unexpected happened. Joe listened, and what he heard changed everything. He heard talent, real talent. Rather than focusing on the broken string, he recognized potential. That moment became a turning point, not only for the family, but for music history itself. Soon, Joe began organizing his sons into a performing group. At first, it was a small family act, nothing more. They practiced relentlessly, performed at local venues, entered talent competitions, and slowly they began attracting attention. The group evolved over time. The performances improved. The crowds grew larger. Then came the youngest performer, Michael. Even as a child, Michael Jackson possessed something difficult to explain: stage presence, charisma, natural ability. Whatever audiences expected from a young performer, Michael seemed capable of exceeding it. People noticed immediately, and before long, so did the music industry. The group eventually became known as the Jackson Five. What began as a local family act soon transformed into a national sensation. Record deals followed, television appearances followed, hit songs followed. Within a remarkably short time, the Jackson family had traveled from Gary, Indiana, to the center of the entertainment world. To many observers, the story appeared almost magical. A hardworking father, talented children. A dream realized through discipline and sacrifice. But the DNA discovery adds another layer entirely, because hidden behind the public story was a much older family journey. A journey stretching back generations before music, before fame, before television. The Jackson family's rise did not begin in recording studios. It began with people like Rose, like July, like Israel, like Nero, individuals whose names rarely appear in history books, but whose choices made everything that followed possible. Every generation contributed something: survival, strength, determination, adaptability. Those qualities traveled forward through time, eventually reaching Joe Jackson and his children. Seen from that perspective, the family's success feels less like an isolated miracle and more like the culmination of generations of perseverance. Of course, fame also brought new challenges. The pressures placed upon Michael Jackson would become unlike anything his ancestors could have imagined. Global celebrity, media scrutiny, public controversy, enormous expectations. For much of his life, Michael wrestled with questions about identity, belonging, and self-definition. Ironically, while the world watched him constantly, an important part of his own family history remained unknown. The truth about July, the truth about the Richburg connection, the truth hidden within the family's DNA. Michael never lived to learn what modern genealogy would eventually reveal. By the time the discovery emerged, he had already been gone for years, yet the findings offer a remarkable perspective. Because behind every celebrity stands generations of people whose lives made that success possible. People whose names are forgotten, people whose stories disappear, people history almost leaves behind. The DNA research helped bring some of those forgotten individuals back into view. And in doing so, it transformed the Jackson family narrative from a story about fame into something much deeper, a story about survival, a story about identity, and a story about how the past continues shaping the present, even when nobody realizes it. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this discovery isn't what it says about the Jackson family alone. It's what it reveals about thousands of families across America, uncovering similar truths through genetic genealogy, because the Jackson family's story is far from unique. In many ways, it represents a much larger national story, one that is still being uncovered today. At first glance, this entire story appears to be about one family, a famous family, a family connected to one of the most recognizable names in modern history. But the deeper researchers looked, the clearer something became. This wasn't really a story about celebrity, it was a story about America. The reason this discovery resonates with so many people has very little to do with music and fame or Michael Jackson's extraordinary career. Instead, it reflects a reality shared by countless families whose roots disappear into the era of slavery for generations. Many African American families faced a unique challenge when attempting to trace their ancestry. The historical record simply stops, names vanish, parents become impossible to identify, birthplaces disappear, family connections dissolve into silence. The reason is deeply connected to slavery itself. Unlike free citizens, enslaved people often left behind very few records of their own. When they appeared in official documents at all, it was frequently as property rather than individuals. A person's life might be reduced to a single line in an inventory, a first name, an estimated age, a monetary value, nothing more. For descendants attempting to reconstruct family history centuries later, these gaps create enormous challenges. Entire branches of family trees can disappear. Questions remain unanswered for generations. And when records fail, families often turn to oral history. Stories become essential. Grandparents pass memories to children. Children pass them to grandchildren. These stories preserve identity when paperwork cannot. In many cases, oral traditions prove surprisingly accurate, but not always. Sometimes stories evolve, details change, assumptions fill gaps left by missing information, and occasionally, families inherit explanations that feel emotionally meaningful, even if they are not entirely correct. The Jackson family's belief in Native American ancestry appears to fit within that larger pattern. For generations, it provided continuity. It offered answers where documentation was missing, and perhaps most importantly, it helped preserve identity. When DNA evidence emerged, it didn't necessarily erase that story. Instead, it expanded it. It revealed that reality was more complicated than anyone realized. And that happens more often than many people think. Across the United States, genetic genealogy is transforming family history research. Every year, thousands of people discover ancestors they never knew existed. Long-lost relatives reconnect. Family mysteries are solved. Historical assumptions are challenged. And sometimes, entire narratives are rewritten. For descendants of enslaved people, these discoveries can be especially meaningful, because every confirmed ancestor represents a recovered identity. Every name recovered from a forgotten document restores part of a life history nearly erased. That is why many genealogists describe their work as more than research. They see it as restoration, a process of returning names, stories, and humanity to people who were often denied all three. In that sense, The most important figure in this story may not be Michael Jackson at all. It may be July. Think about that. For more than 2 centuries, July existed mostly as a name buried inside historical records, a brief reference in legal documents, a forgotten figure at the margins of recorded history. Yet through the efforts of descendants, historians, and genetic researchers, his story resurfaced. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to remind the world that he was real. He lived, he loved, he raised a family, and his descendants would eventually influence global culture in ways nobody could have imagined. That transformation, from forgotten ancestor to recognized individual, may be the most meaningful outcome of all, because genealogy is ultimately about people, not charts, not databases, not DNA markers, people. Every branch of a family tree represents real human experiences, victories, losses, dreams, struggles, and the Jackson family story contains all of those elements. From slavery to freedom, from poverty to prosperity, from rural plantations to global fame. It spans some of the most important chapters in American history. Yet even after all the discoveries, one important lesson remains. Genealogy rarely provides simple answers. Most families are not defined by a single origin story. Instead, they are shaped by countless influences woven together across generations. African ancestry, European ancestry, Native American ancestry, migration, culture, faith, family traditions. All of these factors contribute to identity, and often, the truth is more complex than anyone expects. That complexity is not a weakness. It is part of what makes family history so fascinating. The Jackson family's journey demonstrates exactly that. What began as a search for confirmation became a journey toward deeper understanding. And in the process, a centuries-old mystery was finally brought into the light. Yet there is still one final chapter to tell. Because beyond the science, beyond the records, and beyond the family tree itself, this discovery raises a powerful question. What would Michael Jackson have thought if he had lived long enough to learn the truth? The answer, of course, can never be known. But considering Michael's lifelong search for identity, belonging, and self-understanding, the possibility is difficult to ignore. And that is where this remarkable story ultimately comes full circle. At first glance, this entire story appears to be about one family, a famous family, a family connected to one of the most recognizable names in modern history. But the deeper researchers looked, the clearer something became. This wasn't really a story about celebrity, it was a story about America. The reason this discovery resonates with so many people has very little to do with music and fame or Michael Jackson's extraordinary career. Instead, it reflects a reality shared by countless families whose roots disappear into the era of slavery for generations. Many African American families faced a unique challenge when attempting to trace their ancestry. The historical record simply stops, names vanish, parents become impossible to identify, birthplaces disappear, family connections dissolve into silence. The reason is deeply connected to slavery itself. Unlike free citizens, enslaved people often left behind very few records of their own. When they appeared in official documents at all, it was frequently as property rather than individuals. A person's life might be reduced to a single line in an inventory, a first name, an estimated age, a monetary value, nothing more. For descendants attempting to reconstruct family history centuries later, these gaps create enormous challenges. Entire branches of family trees can disappear. Questions remain unanswered for generations. And when records fail, families often turn to oral history. Stories become essential. Grandparents pass memories to children. Children pass them to grandchildren. These stories preserve identity when paperwork cannot. In many cases, oral traditions prove surprisingly accurate, but not always. Sometimes stories evolve, details change, assumptions fill gaps left by missing information, and occasionally, families inherit explanations that feel emotionally meaningful, even if they are not entirely correct. The Jackson family's belief in Native American ancestry appears to fit within that larger pattern. For generations, it provided continuity. It offered answers where documentation was missing, and perhaps most importantly, it helped preserve identity. When DNA evidence emerged, it didn't necessarily erase that story. Instead, it expanded it. It revealed that reality was more complicated than anyone realized. And that happens more often than many people think. Across the United States, genetic genealogy is transforming family history research. Every year, thousands of people discover ancestors they never knew existed. Long-lost relatives reconnect. Family mysteries are solved. Historical assumptions are challenged. And sometimes, entire narratives are rewritten. For descendants of enslaved people, these discoveries can be especially meaningful, because every confirmed ancestor represents a recovered identity. Every name recovered from a forgotten document restores part of a life history nearly erased. That is why many genealogists describe their work as more than research. They see it as restoration, a process of returning names, stories, and humanity to people who were often denied all three. In that sense, the most important figure in this story may not be Michael Jackson at all. It may be July. Think about that. For more than 2 centuries, July existed mostly as a name buried inside historical records, a brief reference in legal documents, a forgotten figure at the margins of recorded history. Yet through the efforts of descendants, historians, and genetic researchers, his story resurfaced. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to remind the world that he was real, he lived, he loved, he raised a family, and his descendants would eventually influence global culture in ways nobody could have imagined. That transformation, from forgotten ancestor to recognized individual, may be the most meaningful outcome of all, because genealogy is ultimately about people, not charts, not databases, not DNA markers, people. Every branch of a family tree represents real human experiences, victories, losses, dreams, struggles, and the Jackson family story contains all of those elements. From slavery to freedom, from poverty to prosperity, from rural plantations to global fame. It spans some of the most important chapters in American history. Yet even after all the discoveries, one important lesson remains. Genealogy rarely provides simple answers. Most families are not defined by a single origin story. Instead, they are shaped by countless influences woven together across generations. African ancestry, European ancestry, Native American ancestry, migration, culture, faith, family traditions. All of these factors contribute to identity, and often, the truth is more complex than anyone expects. That complexity is not a weakness. It is part of what makes family history so fascinating. The Jackson family's journey demonstrates exactly that. What began as a search for confirmation became a journey toward deeper understanding. And in the process, a centuries-old mystery was finally brought into the light. Yet there is still one final chapter to tell. Because beyond the science, beyond the records, and beyond the family tree itself, this discovery raises a powerful question. What would Michael Jackson have thought if he had lived long enough to learn the truth? The answer, of course, can never be known. But considering Michael's lifelong search for identity, belonging, and self-understanding, the possibility is difficult to ignore. And that is where this remarkable story ultimately comes full circle. One of the most fascinating aspects of this entire story is that the person most closely associated with it never actually learned about it. Michael Jackson died in 2009. The genealogical breakthrough that reshaped his family's history came years later. By the time researchers connected historical records, DNA evidence, and family documents, Michael was already gone. And yet, in a strange way, this discovery feels deeply connected to the larger story of his life. Because if there was one theme that appeared repeatedly throughout Michael Jackson's journey, it was identity. Few public figures in modern history have been examined as closely as Michael Jackson. From the moment he emerged as the standout performer of the Jackson 5, the world watched him constantly. Every performance, every interview, every appearance, every personal decision. For decades, millions of people felt as though they knew him. Yet Michael often seemed to be searching for something himself. A sense of belonging, a sense of peace, a clear understanding of who he truly was beyond the headlines and public expectations. As a child, his identity was shaped largely by others. He was a member of the Jackson 5, Joe Jackson's son, Motown's young star, a performer expected to meet extraordinary standards every single day. Success arrived early, but so did pressure. As Michael grew older, the challenges became more complicated. The world saw a superstar, one of the most successful entertainers who had ever lived. But behind that image was a man struggling with fame, unlike anything previous generations had experienced. Every aspect of his appearance became a topic of discussion. Every change became front-page news. Speculation followed him everywhere. Questions about his race, questions about his health, questions about his family, questions about his personal life. Over time, Michael became one of the most analyzed individuals in modern culture. Yet, despite all that attention, some of the most important details about his family's history remained completely unknown. While journalists investigated controversies and tabloids chased rumors, a far more significant story remained hidden nearly 2 centuries in the past. No one knew that the Jackson family's understanding of its own origins was incomplete. No one knew that a forgotten ancestor named July sat at the center of an unresolved historical mystery. And no one knew that future DNA testing would reveal a connection stretching back to a South Carolina plantation. There is something almost ironic about that reality. Michael spent much of his life trying to control how the world perceived him. He carefully crafted his public image. He built creative worlds through music, videos, and performances. He transformed himself repeatedly throughout his career, yet beneath all of that existed a family history he never had the opportunity to fully understand. A story written long before his birth, long before fame, long before music, long before anyone could imagine the name Jackson becoming famous around the globe. The discovery highlights something important about family history itself. No matter how successful someone becomes, no matter how famous or influential they appear, everyone remains connected to the generations that came before them. Behind every public figure stands an entire chain of ancestors, some remembered, some forgotten, some documented, some nearly erased from history altogether. Michael Jackson may have become one of the most recognizable people on Earth, but his story still traces back to ordinary individuals navigating extraordinary circumstances. People like Rose, people like July, people like Israel and Nero, individuals whose names rarely appear in textbooks, but whose choices shaped the future in ways they could never have imagined. When July was living in South Carolina, there was no way he could have predicted that one of his descendants would someday become a global icon. When Nero struggled to build a life after emancipation, he could not have known that future generations of his family would perform before millions. History rarely provides that perspective in the moment. Only later do we see how individual lives connect across centuries. Perhaps that is why discoveries like this resonate so strongly. They remind us that history is not just about famous people. It is about families, communities, generations, the countless lives that quietly contribute to larger stories. In many ways, the DNA discovery transformed Michael Jackson's family history from a celebrity narrative into something much more human. Instead of focusing on fame, it focused on ancestry. Instead of headlines, it focused on heritage. Instead of scandal, it focused on truth. And that truth proved far more meaningful than any rumor ever could, because unlike the sensational claims that often surrounded Michael Jackson during his lifetime, this story was supported by evidence, historical records, genetic testing, documented family connections. Together, they revealed a forgotten chapter that had remained hidden for generations, a chapter Michael himself never had the opportunity to read. Yet even though he never learned about the discovery, its significance remains undeniable. It adds depth to the story of one of the most famous families in modern history, and it reminds us that even the world's biggest stars remain connected to the same questions that have fascinated human beings for centuries. Who were our ancestors? Where did we come from? And how did their choices shape the lives we live today? Those questions lead directly to the final chapter of this remarkable story. Because in the end, this discovery was never really about proving a family legend right or wrong. It was about recovering something that history had nearly erased. And that may be the most important lesson of all. In the end, the most remarkable part of the story is not the DNA itself. It is not the genetic markers, not the laboratory reports, and not even the historical documents that connected the pieces together. The most remarkable part is that the truth survived at all. For more than 2 centuries, the story remained hidden beneath layers of time. A plantation owner's will, a forgotten estate inventory, a family tradition passed from one generation to another, fragments of history scattered across archives, memories, and DNA individually. None of those pieces seem powerful enough to tell the whole story, but together they revealed something extraordinary. They revealed a human life that history almost erased. When most people hear the name Michael Jackson, they think of music, sold-out stadiums, record-breaking albums, unforgettable performances, fame on a scale rarely seen before or since. But behind that global legacy stands another story, a much older story, one that began long before the world ever heard of the Jackson 5, long before Gary, Indiana, long before Motown, long before Michael Jackson took his first steps onto a stage. It began with people whose names rarely appear in headlines: a woman named Rose, a man named July, a son named Israel, a descendant named Nero. Individuals who lived through some of the most difficult chapters in American history and somehow found ways to survive, build families, and create futures for generations they would never meet. That is what this discovery ultimately uncovered. Not scandal, not controversy, not a celebrity secret. It uncovered a lineage, a chain of human lives stretching across centuries. And perhaps that is why the story feels so powerful, because it reminds us that every family carries mysteries. Every family has chapters that disappear into the past. Every family contains people whose stories were never fully recorded. The difference is that modern science now gives us tools our ancestors never had. DNA testing has opened doors that once seemed permanently closed. Questions that remained unanswered for generations can now, in some cases, finally be explored. Names can be connected, relationships can be confirmed, lost histories can be reconstructed. For descendants of enslaved people, that possibility carries enormous significance. The institution of slavery did more than deny freedom. It interrupted family histories. It separated parents from children. It erased identities. It replaced personal histories with property records. The effects of that erasure lasted for generations, and in many ways, they continue to be felt today. That is why discoveries like this matter. They help restore what was taken, not completely, not perfectly, but meaningfully. When researchers uncovered the truth about July's origins, they were doing more than solving a genealogical puzzle. They were returning a piece of identity to a family. They were restoring context to a story that had remained incomplete for generations. And perhaps most importantly, they were transforming a forgotten ancestor into a fully human figure once again. A man with a mother, a family, a life, a legacy. That legacy eventually reached one of the most famous entertainers in history. Yet the discovery remains meaningful even beyond the Jackson family, because it reflects something universal: the desire to understand where we come from, the desire to know who our ancestors were, the desire to see ourselves as part of a larger story. In many ways, genealogy is not really about the past. It is about connection. It is about understanding how countless individual lives combine to shape the present. Every person alive today is the result of an unbroken chain stretching back through history. Millions of decisions, millions of struggles, millions of moments, all leading to the present. The Jackson family's discovery simply makes that reality easier to see. Think about how close this story came to disappearing forever. If one document had been lost, if one record had been destroyed, if one descendant had never become curious enough to start searching, the truth might never have surfaced. The mystery could have remained unresolved indefinitely. Instead, a single decision changed everything. One family member decided to ask a question: where did we come from? That question launched a journey through archives, family stories, and genetic science. A journey that ultimately reached back more than 200 years, and at the end of that journey stood an answer nobody expected. Not a sensational revelation, not a shocking celebrity scandal, but something far more meaningful. A recovered history, a forgotten connection, a missing chapter finally restored. Michael Jackson spent his life under an extraordinary spotlight. Few people in history have been observed, discussed, and analyzed so intensely, yet despite all that attention, one of the most important discoveries connected to his family would happen only after he was gone. A quiet revelation, one uncovered not by reporters or tabloids, but by patience, research, and science. And perhaps that is the perfect ending to this story. Because the deepest family secrets are not always hidden deliberately. Sometimes they are simply buried by time, buried beneath generations of silence, buried beneath missing records and forgotten names, waiting for someone willing to search, waiting for someone curious enough to ask questions, waiting for history to finally give up one of its answers. More than 200 years after a man named July appeared in a plantation record, that answer finally emerged. And in doing so, it changed the Jackson family's understanding of itself forever.